right. So thank you all for joining today. If you are in here, you are hopefully wanting to learn a little bit more about your resume or your CV, as the case may be. So that is what we're going to talk about today as well. I'm going to give you just a little bit of background information. We're going to go through some steps, and then I'm going to tell you a whole bunch of different things about resumes and CVs and what to put on them and what not to put on them. And those of you who did submit resumes or CVs in advance, I have emailed those back to you, so feel free to follow along. No guarantees that I got everything we're going to talk about today, so you still probably want to pay attention, even though I gave you some feedback. So the other thing I would add is if you do have questions at any point, you can do a couple of different things. If you are comfortable unmuting yourself, again, remember this is being recorded, then feel free to do that. You can just unmute yourself, jump in at any point, that's fine. Or if you'd prefer to just throw something in the chat, you can do that as well. And I will try to answer them as we're going along, but certainly I will be able to answer those if I happen to miss one of the questions that you pose at the end once we're through everything. So I hope that all sounds good, and we will go ahead and get started. So generally, you're probably here figuring out, like, why am I here? What do I need a resume for? And so forth. So I want to talk a little bit about the preparation that goes into putting together a resume or a CV. Either way, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably. Also, what the effective elements are. So if you want to have a good document, what things you need to keep in mind. Resources and services of my office, of course, and then next steps for you all moving forward from here. So in the recruiting process, and it really doesn't matter what type of an event you're going to, what type of an end goal you have, if you want to work in government, if you want to work in industry, if you want to work in academia, the resume is, as you can see from this timeline, still pretty early in the process. Ultimately, the only goal of that resume is to get you sort of moved through to the interview stage. So the interview is really where it's most important. Thus, you want to be sure that you're communicating the main message that you're trying to get across. And that's going to vary a little bit based on the type of employer that you're interested in or the type of area that you want to go into. But in general, you want to think about that before you even put together your resume. Now, obviously, most of us just throw everything on our resume right at the beginning, and that's pretty common. But the more you can think of in advance of why you're putting together what you're putting together and why, the more effective your resume is going to be as well. You also want to be sure that you're focusing on the accomplishments that you have, the outcomes, and you'll hear me talking about this a lot today. But if you're not focusing on sort of the so what did I do, what did I accomplish and achieve, it doesn't matter how much information or how many words you have on your CV, because that's what employers are really interested in. You do also need to personalize and differentiate your resume or your CV, and that means from another person, but it also means for the type of position that you're applying for. So every once in a while, I'll have a student who's still kind of waffling between whether they're going academia or whether maybe they're going into industry. Those two documents are going to look very different. So every single piece needs to be personalized and differentiated. So what is the difference between sort of that resume and CV? As I mentioned, those terms tend to be used very interchangeably. In general, the resume is for industry and the CV is for everything else. So whether it's academia, government, international positions. That being said, that's not always the case. So sometimes you'll have a company that is maybe primarily based in the EU. And so they're going to tend to use the term CV because resume is sort of an American thing that we talk about. Or sometimes you'll have a company that's not, just say, send me your CV. The general difference, though, is about page length. So there are a few other differences as far as content, but generally you're talking about a resume at the PhD or postdoc level is 2 pages if you're applying to industry. CVs technically can be as long as you want. Now, there are some parameters that we'll talk about there as well. But that's the basic difference. So if you say resume or if you say CV, it doesn't really matter. It's pretty much the same thing. So I talked a little bit about that preparation, and that's a piece you need to pay attention to. So the very first thing you want to think about is, what are my strengths and what are my weaknesses? Not because you want your weaknesses on your resume or CV, but because you need to know what they are. So if you maybe only have 2 publications, you want to highlight some other things about your research experience or about some of your accomplishments to sort of make up for only having 2 publications. In some cases, 2 publications is great. You know, if you have the front cover of Nature, it doesn't matter if you have nothing else. The other thing is, you want to think about what type of employer you're interested in, and whether, you know, even within that, if you're say, okay, I'm interested in industry, do you think you want startups, small companies, large organizations? All of that is going to play into how your documents look as well. Then you want to think about your transferable skills, experiences that you have that are going to be of interest to your potential employer. So maybe your research was in batteries and you don't want to stay in batteries, but the skills that you obtained, the things that you did, are important enough to apply to another type of industry or another field. So then you're going to minimize the fact that the work you did was on batteries and focus more on the work you did, if that makes sense. You also want to be sure that you are prioritizing really what you want to include. So that would be, what categories do you think are the most important? What do you want to highlight? So for most of you, that's going to be education first. Definitely if you're on your PhD or you're working on your PhD, then education should be your first category. Postdocs might be a little bit different. You may want to bump that industry or the actual research experience up to the #1 as opposed to having education. It's kind of up to you how long you've been a postdoc, how fruitful your postdoc position has been, and so forth. Some people will kind of get around that issue by putting postdoc as an additional education entry. That's perfectly acceptable too. After that, generally your research is going to be the next most important thing. Now, for some of you, that might vary. So maybe you don't want to do anything related to your research, bench work, whatever the case might be, forever, but you like writing and you want to go into a writing role. So in those cases, maybe you'd have some other experience that would be focusing on writing that you would move up to the top or the second section. And then usually, so again, the standard is education, then research, then publications. Again, back to that first bullet where I said, if you've got a weakness, you don't have any publications, or they're all in prep, you don't have anything that's actually been even submitted, then maybe your publication section shouldn't be #3 of prominence. So maybe you'd want to move some awards or some leadership roles first and move your publications or presentation sections lower. So thinking about the prioritizing of your resume or your CV and what's most important, what best sells your story, that's the order of categories that you want to use on that document. Again, the purpose of this document is for you to get an interview. That's it, nothing else. So you want to be telling the story that they want to hear rather than just sharing everything that you've ever done, because that might not be relevant to what they want to hear. All right, so what are the effective resumes looking like? So probably or possibly a category might be like an objective or a summary or highlights. Now, most of you that submitted your documents to me didn't have these on there, so that's why I kind of have some question marks. This isn't probably standard for most people's documents. Now, certainly if you're wanting to change gears, so maybe you've done all your research in, again, it's been more bench work, but suddenly you want to focus on writing. In that case, you probably want to have an objective to show that, like, I didn't make a mistake. I'm actually purposefully applying to this position. Highlight section, kind of the same thing. And I would recommend having one or the other. So not a summary and highlights and an objective, but just pick one of those if you are going to choose to include that. At the top, you're generally going to have your name and your contact information. That should be your personal information. So don't include work information. If any of your PIs or your advisors showed you their documents, they probably have their work information on there. A job search is a little bit different than applying for a grant. So if you are applying for a grant or a fellowship, then your work is what you're highlighting. So in those cases, you should have your work address on there because it's what you're doing is tied to what your job is. But when you're applying for a job, that is for your personal like benefit. And so that should only be your personal address. All right, education section is another category, and that should always be like every category in reverse chronological order. So that again would mean if you do choose to include your postdoc in this section, your postdoc first, your education first, and so forth. And I see your question about objective, and I will get there in just a minute. Your research experience is probably then the next section, like I said, for most of you, but experience in general should probably be your next category. So if you are applying to a PUI because you want to primarily be teaching, then maybe your teaching section is higher than your research section and so forth. Publications is another category that you're typically going to include, sometimes presentations. You want to make sure that you're highlighting your name somehow. Most people do that with bolding, just so that it sticks out, especially if you have a bunch of first authorships. Like I said, presentations, same thing. You might want to include leadership and activities, and that's, again, going to depend on what you're selling to your potential employer. I mentioned that teaching experience already. Some of you might also have even some industry experience. So maybe you've worked before you came to school. And if you're applying in industry, that's going to be really important to that potential employer. So that might be a higher category. Honors and awards. And then sometimes people will include a skills section. Now, personally, I think skills fit a lot better if you can actually integrate them into the experience itself. But if you can't, sometimes you just have so many different pieces of instruments that you've worked with. It's hard to integrate those into bullets, so you can just put those on as sort of an other skills. And then other information kind of depends on you. And we'll talk about all of these categories in more detail. Ultimately, though, again, as I mentioned earlier, you want to really focus on the accomplishments, the outcomes, not just a job description. All right, so let's talk about some general formatting. And then, like I said, I'll come back to breaking down each of these categories. So some things to keep in mind, just no matter what type of an employer you're applying to, no matter whether you're doing a CV or a resume, all of that's going to be basically the same formatting rules. How it looks is really important. So if you're using a lot of different spacing, here you use double spacing, here you use single spacing, here it's cluttered, it looks hard to read, and people aren't going to read it. Likewise, I haven't ever had this problem with my grad students, but some undergrads will make it really cute looking, put a bunch of little icons on it, or make their bullets into chemistry beakers instead of an actual just round bullet. So things like that, you want it to look professional and clean. As I mentioned, lengthwise, 2 pages for industry, technically as long as you want for everybody else, but generally only the first 3 pages are going to get read by a human being. So you want to make sure the most powerful sections and information is on those first 3 pages, even if that means putting publications continued or something like that later on, in order to fit the most impactful things on the first 3 pages. So you can go as long as you want, but keep in mind that humans get tired of reading after a while. Now, if they love you after they've scanned through those first 3 pages, then they'll probably go back and read the other 20 pages that you have included. But focus on those first 3 in particular. Font size should be a 10 to 12 point, and that, headings can be bigger, your name can be bigger, that kind of thing. Your page break every page break needs to be clean and neat. So try not to split an individual item over a page break. So for example, the bullet right before, I would not want the page break to come between 10 to 12 point font width and then have exception of headings to fit on the second line. You want the page breaks to sort of fall in between an individual job. And that if you have to have a shortened first page, so be it, just so that you can have a clean and neat page break. You also want to make sure that if you do have to split a category, so maybe you've got one job on page 1 and then the other 4 jobs on page 2, put experience continued at the top of that page 2 and then have all 3 of those jobs listed out. Finally, you want to have your name on every page. So the first page already has your name. So you don't need to repeat it in the footer or the header there. But on page 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever, you want to have your full name and a page number on all of those subsequent pages. Consistency is also very important. So even though the information isn't exactly the same, you want all of your titles to look the same. So if they're first in your education section, your degree titles, then your job title should be first in your experience section. If they're bold, then all job titles should be bold. All employer, school, organization names, those should all be listed the same way, and all of your dates should be listed the same way. So as I was looking through some of your documents that you submitted in advance, probably the biggest thing I saw there was sometimes people would put like dates at the beginning, but later in the CV would have them at the end. So just be consistent. The other thing is sometimes people would have dates in parentheses, but other times they weren't in parentheses. So again, just that consistency helps for a couple of reasons. One, it just makes it look cleaner and neater and organized. The other thing is, as a scientist, attention to detail is so important, as you all know. You know, moving a decimal point one place could have really serious ramifications. So this is one way, by showing that attention to detail on your CV, of demonstrating that you have that skill. And then finally, it's just easier on the eyes, so people are, as much as you can enjoy reading a CV, going to enjoy reading your documents better. Likewise, you need to very much be careful about typos, and sometimes they're so easy to miss. One of the most common ones, which I think is hilarious, for my chemists, is the word lead / lead / lead, if you look at the periodic table. But make sure if you're using lead, as in I led someone, it's LED. And if you're saying I will lead someone, then it's LEAD. So things like that, keep in mind those typos. I mentioned having bulleted lists a couple of times already, but that's important because people aren't going to read paragraphs. Just like I said, people probably aren't really going to pay much attention beyond page 3 unless they really like you. They're not going to read through a paragraph, they're going to skim it. So if there's anything that you don't care if they skim or not, then it shouldn't even be on your documents. So put those in action verb lists, focus on those outcomes. No personal pronouns should go really anywhere on your resume. Sometimes you can get by with them in an objective statement, but generally, otherwise, no personal pronouns. Also, don't put an I mark. So again, that kind of goes back to where the address should go to. Because this is your personal document, you're doing a job search that would only benefit you. It's not going to benefit the university for us to lose you. You don't put the I mark, it's not work related. So also don't make it cute, like I said, bullets. And actually, graphics in general should be minimized as much as possible. For those of you applying to academia, like many things in the job search process, we're still a little bit behind. So typically having a lot of graphics isn't really going to make a big difference on your resume. It's not going to mess with the system because it's pretty much just uploading it as a PDF. In industry and in government and other places like that, though, they actually run it through an applicant tracking system. So a lot of times we refer to that as ATS. Those applicant tracking systems don't know how to read resumes super well. And so if you have a lot of graphics, whether it's lines or italics or pictures, it messes it all up and it actually shows as gobbledygook on your resume. So it's better not to include or to minimize those things as much as possible. So bolding usually is okay. Italics sometimes. Lines, as long as they're, minimal. So like maybe at the top of your resume, maybe a few in between categories, but don't put a bunch of lines. Don't put a bunch of little cute pictures to show, oh, this one's my phone number. Obviously, we know that. So keeping those graphics minimized. All right, so let's get into the resume itself or the CV itself. And let me walk you through each section, all the different information and so forth. So what goes at the top? First of all, again, your name, your personal contact information. So that should be personal, not work. And how much you include is up to you. But at minimum, you need to have an email address and a phone number. If you want to include a full mailing address, that's fine, kind of up to you. A lot of people will include like an address of, like if your permanent address is in New Jersey and you're applying for jobs in New Jersey, you might want to demonstrate that to them. to be honest, it doesn't really matter as much at the grad level as something like that would matter at the undergrad. If they want you, they're going to relocate you wherever they need you. So that's up to you. Some people will choose to put like a LinkedIn profile. That's fine too, as long as your LinkedIn is error-free. It might include some links and things like that that can show people more information. So that could be helpful to include as well. But what you include is kind of up to you. I did mention that your name needs to be on every single page. And I would say your full name. For most of us, we have, kind of common enough surnames or last names that it might be hard to differentiate. Yes, I would say 90% of the time people are always going to keep this in an electronic format. But if for some reason they don't, they print it off into paper and they drop the paper on the floor, you want it to be easy for them to put your pages back together. Also, sometimes even in our office, we'll download a whole bunch of documents for employers when they're coming to campus, which might include your research statement and your resume and your cover letter. And it's hard to tell sometimes where one student's documents begin and another one's end. So having your name, either header or footer of every single page, whether it's a research statement, whether it's a resume, is really helpful. As far as the title of your document, it's really not necessary. So I did notice some of you had put like resume or CV at the top of your document. Obviously, I know that's what it is, so that's not necessary to include. And then I also mentioned it's kind of up to you if you choose to include an objective or a highlight or a summary. Highlights and summaries are typically more of they're longer, but I would still say try to keep them into bullets, because if you've got a big paragraph at the top, people still aren't going to read that. Now that would be different between somebody saying like, what are your research interests? So again, usually that would be a separate document, but if you choose to include it, you can have a few sentences there. With an objective, it should be focused on what you can do for the employer. So an objective like, I'd like to get a job as a research scientist at Dow probably isn't appropriate because you're talking about what you want. So instead, I would say to utilize my, I don't know, such and such instrument skill at such and such, using it in this way to become an analytical chemist at Dow. So focusing more on what you're doing for them or trying to help them, as opposed to what you're looking for. So I hope that helps explain that just a little bit more. All right, so let's talk about your education experience quickly. Always, with U of I, it's a great program. It's a very strong program. So if those of you who are working on your PhDs, I would definitely include your education at the top. And even if you're not, even if you're a postdoc and you did, a degree somewhere else, that's totally fine too. If you've worked for quite a while, you might want to still put your work experience ahead of your education. That's something we can certainly talk about on an individual basis. You want to include both your grad degrees and your undergrad degrees. Demonstrate what your actual major was. So don't just assume that we know. Don't just put PhD, for example, at the University of Illinois. PhD in chemistry. Likewise, same thing with undergrad. If you have been here maybe just 2 or 3 years, you're not going to know what your anticipated graduation date is, so that's fine. You can say 2020 to present. But if you're within a year or so and you've kind of had that conversation with the PI already, then I would definitely put expected August 2020 or summer 2020 or whatever the case might be. Well, I guess that would be in the past, summer 2021. And yes, employers do care about your GPA. I know a lot of times you hear from faculty members that they never care about your grad GPAs. Many do. So I would recommend, if you have above a 3.5, 3.6 in grad school, to put it on your resume. If you don't, just leave it off. But I would also then probably leave off your undergrad GPA just so it doesn't look strange. And then undergrad GPA is typically sort of around the same thing. We tell our undergrad students as long as they have above a 3.0, but I'm sure you all do since you are here. So if you put one on, I would put both on. And then related skills that might be applicable if it makes sense here. So for example, sometimes people put in people will put in that they are looking at a thesis statement or something. So that's going to demonstrate some skills. You could put that under your education if it makes sense there. Certifications could be another category, or you could just stick it under your education. I'll show you an example in just a minute. So we have a couple of different certificates here on our campus. So sometimes our grad students will work on a certificate in teaching through CITL, or they might work on a business and entrepreneurship certificate or something like that. So that could also go in that education section. So here's just a basic example. Like I said, you've got your current degree first, then there's that certificate in business with the dates, and then your undergraduate degree. List GPAs if they're strong. It doesn't have to look like this, but this is just sort of an example to demonstrate that everything is consistent throughout and how that would look like. So if you want to put your degrees first and then do a comma and then do your, totally up to you. All right, experience is the next section, and this can take on a lot of different forms. Sometimes you're going to put all three, whether you have industry, or maybe you did an internship even when you're an undergrad, teaching experience, research experience, you might integrate it all and just call it experience. Kind of depends on the industry or the employer that you're applying to, though. If you are applying to industry and you have industry experience, you might want to highlight that, pull that out, because most grad students don't. Or if you're applying to an academic, like I said, a primarily undergraduate institution, you might want to demonstrate if you've had multiple teaching roles and so forth. Otherwise, you know, you might want to just say, you know, I'm just going to combine everything in and put it in reverse chronological order. Kind of up to you. And then as far as order, again, pay attention to who you're applying to. So where is it relevant? If your research is more important than your teaching experience and you've got two separate categories, then research experience should probably go second. If you are applying to industry, you might think, yeah, teaching experience doesn't matter at all, but it might still. So if you had an actual, you know, place where you taught students who didn't have a clue about your field, maybe you taught Gen Chem, for example, and you had to explain stuff to students who maybe it was even Gen Chem for non-majors. That skill of being able to teach somebody something that they don't know anything about is important no matter what employer you're working for. So maybe you still include your teaching experience category, even if you're going into an industry type role. Kind of depends on you as an individual, what type of teaching experience you've had, as well as the type of employer that you're planning to apply to. And that also depends on where it goes. So generally, I would think this is going to be a pretty important section. For postdocs, again, you might want to put it even above your education. For everybody else, it's probably going to be your second category. You're going to want to include your title, the name of the employer, which for most of us is going to be like a name of a university, and when you were employed. If you're applying, or if your employer is the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, you probably don't need to repeat Illinois or Urbana-Champaign. But if you're applying to Cornell, or you worked at Cornell, then there might be multiple Cornells. I mean, there's only one truly Cornell, but you know, smaller universities here and there. So in that case, probably be better to include the actual location as well. When you put on your descriptions, again, they should be in bullet format. So lists rather than big paragraphs. Typically each list item should probably only be like 2 or 3 lines of your resume. If you're getting into that 3-4 line for each one of those bullets, then you need to split those into a couple. And I know it's hard because sometimes you've got really long, if you're writing out an instrument name instead of abbreviating it, or if you're writing out a chemical name, definitely some of those get really long. But as much as possible, you want to keep those readable. The other thing is you really want to focus on the outcomes. So instead of just saying that you synthesize something, what are you hoping to accomplish? Synthesize such and such in order to define, or in order to determine and show what the outcome was, as well as what it was that you actually did. Not limited to paid employment. So of course, include your grad research on there, but even if you volunteered and you did something that was pretty monumental that could potentially go into your experience section. Again, it depends on what you're applying for and what they might be most interested in. Now, I kind of briefly mentioned this earlier, but my recommendation is, as much as possible, include those instruments in this section. Include the skill sets in this section, because if you can actually show me how you used IR, you use that in order to do such and such, I'm going to believe that you have those skills. Sometimes that's not possible because you've done so many different things and you just have to stick them in a skill section in order to get them on the resume so that the keyword hit will show, and that's fine. Or maybe you used it once your first year in grad school and then you switch projects. So it doesn't necessarily make sense to include it in the bulk of your research experience. You can include it lower. Again, let's talk about that on an individual basis. So here's a basic sort of job description resume. It doesn't really tell me much, right? So it's designed and implemented experiments. That's great. Yeah, what kind of experiments? What does that mean? How many? You're showing me a little bit more about what you studied, but still pretty basic. So this is going to be an example that's more accomplishment based. So showing me actually what you did in order to, or for more accurate drug delivery. So this is the purpose of what that research was for. So the more you can do that, the better it's going to be from any type of an employer that you're applying to, whether it's academia, government, industry, something completely different. Also demonstrating not just like trained grad students, but show me how many, quantify as much as you can. Demonstrate what you trained them on and what the point was. So anything like that you can focus on accomplishment base is going to be a lot stronger of a resume or CV. Questions about experience before I move on to the next section? That's kind of a big one. Okay. So here is an ugly resume. It's got a lot of things wrong with it. And so I would love to hear from you all a little bit. If you want to, again, maybe throw some things in the chat that you're seeing based on the things that I've just talked about. So what are the mistakes here? None, it looks great. Different fonts, yes. Format is not aligned. It's a paragraph. Nobody wants to read that. What else about that paragraph do you see? Any personal pronouns, awesome. Anybody find any typos on there? There's two. They're kind of hard to spot. I'll give you a little hint here. Here's one of them. So this one, actually, I guess that's both of them. So typos are really easy to miss in things like URLs or email addresses, because in many cases, you might have set your spell checker to skip those types of things. Likewise, in things that are all caps, those tend to get missed as well. So you can actually go into your spell check and change the settings so that it does catch all of those things. Illinois tends to get mistyped quite a bit. Activites apparently is a word of some sort, but it's not what we want on a resume. So that one also gets missed quite a bit. A few of the other things you all mentioned. So this is the only place there's underlining on this whole CV. Definitely a different type of font, which just is distracting when you look at it. This heading has a colon after it, and no other headings have colons after them. So you want to be consistent even on small things like that. Even sometimes I've had, again, because it goes back to that attention to detail skill. So I've had some employers point out things like, oh, well, in August 2016 to present, there's a space on either side of the dash, but nowhere else there is. So just even those little things, try to pay attention to and try to be careful about. Activites or activities is in a title case heading as opposed to in all caps, whereas all the others are in all caps. So again, how you set up the similar type of information throughout the resume should look the same. This is italics, nothing else is italics. there's no grad date at all. So not even a start date and an end date. So I, as an employer, have no idea when you might possibly be available, even within a ballpark. I mean, sure, I can look at the fact that you graduated with your bachelor's in 2016, but maybe you did something in the meantime. So that can be important to include on there as well. You mentioned the paragraph, the personal pronouns, and so forth. So this is a cleaner. It just looks nicer. It's prettier to look at and so forth. It also focuses, as you look at the bullets, more on not just designed and implemented experiments, but so what, in order to refine a method to study the pH microenvironment and so forth. So that's a lot better of a format than the one that we saw previously. Again, it doesn't mean that you have to have this 2-column thing. It doesn't mean that you have to put your titles first. It's totally up to you, just holding to the basic formatting rules of consistency and order and structure. All right, so moving on a little bit more, I want to talk about some of the other categories that you're probably going to include on your documents. Publications, presentations, patents, kind of depends on you again. Now, if you have patents and you're applying to industry, I would absolutely put those in a separate section because that's a big deal. In many cases, you won't, depending on the employer you go to, you might not ever publish again, but you will have patents. Other employers do care still about publications and you will continue to publish. So if that's something that's important to you, look for that when you're looking for an employer. Now, certainly in academia, it's publish or perish for the rest of your life. So how you set that up can vary based on who you're applying to, and again, what you have. You don't have any publications, maybe you only have one and you're like 12th author. Maybe you include publications and presentations in the same section until you get that other publication or so. Whether you're doing any of these things, presentations, publications, you should include the full citation and in some way highlight your name. Again, I prefer bolding over the underlining just because it's less apt to get misread by an ATS, but at least that way you're highlighting somehow. There's a lot of discussion back and forth on submitteds versus impreps. Either way, you want to write out same thing, full citation, your name, your the article title, and so forth. But be sure to add in preparation at the end, or submitted if it's actually been submitted, or in revision. Some employers say, like, I don't care about that. I don't ever want to see that ever. Other employers, and this isn't like by company, it's by individual recruiter at this company. Others will say, yes, show me everything. So it kind of depends on you. Now, I would say if you don't have a first authorship and you're about to, or you're hoping to, that the manuscript is written or close to it enough that you have a title, you might want to include your in preparations because it shows, hey, I've got a first authorship. Otherwise, if you've got a list of 40 publications already, I wouldn't even include the in preparations. I know you want to show what you're working on now, but you can do that through the research experience section as opposed to just adding more and more to your publications list. So again, kind of varies case by case situation. If you have a really long list, if you've been blessed and you've worked your tail off and you have a whole ton of publications to your name, you may not be able to include them all. Now, again, it depends on who you're applying to. So if you're applying in industry, most likely you're going to have to truncate your list. So in that case, I would be sure to include like your numbers. So if you can only fit 5 and still keep your document to 2 pages, then I would say publications 5 of 40, just so that they know how many total you have. Other people will choose to truncate lists even if they're going into academia or government. It's kind of up to you there. Maybe you had 6 publications as an undergrad, but all you did was run this one data set and everybody put you on their papers. Good for you, lucky. But if that's the case, then maybe you don't choose to include those anyway. So it's, again, kind of case by case basis, but if you do choose to truncate, make sure you show how many total you have. And then that skills section, I've talked about a couple of times. If you can't include lab skills somewhere else, it's fine to just do a separate skills section and include them. Otherwise, everything in your skills section really should be technical focused. So computer skills, foreign language skills, things that you can actually tangibly sort of test out in an interview situation. Anything else that might be sort of a unique or special skill, as long as it's that technical side. You don't want to include like, I'm a great team player, or I'm a really strong leader, because that just kind of sounds fluffy and fake. Instead, if you want to demonstrate those skills, that's awesome. But show me. Don't just say, I have these great teamwork skills. Show me by saying, collaborated with interdisciplinary team of scientists from 4 different labs to do X, Y, and Z. So that way you can prove to me, and I'm going to believe it because you actually have this where and how that you have good teamwork skills. Or supervise 12 undergrads. Of course, you must be a good leader, unless you're a terrible leader and they keep leaving, but most likely you're a good leader. So this is just an example. If you want to sort of differentiate, delineate your skills a little bit, you want to include them on there, you could do something like this. Other stuff. So again, this really varies based on you, what you've been involved with. Some students don't have any of this, so it's not really relevant to include. Also, keeping in mind your audience, just like with every other thing that I've said before. For example, in academia, awards are important. They want to know every single award you've gotten. Maybe not as important as your publications or your research, so keep it lower on your resume, but it's still good to include them. So every travel grant, anything. In another situation, maybe in industry, for example, you're probably only going to want to put really the big highlights on there. Now, government, maybe again different. They might care more. So keeping in mind your audience is important as far as how you do that. No matter what, these sections should look the same as your education, as your experience. So if, for example, if you've got an organization you've been involved with, an activity, a leadership role, maybe you're a treasurer of WCC. So if you've listed your degree titles first, treasurer is going to be listed first. If those were bold, that should be bold. Maybe you did a comma and then the name of your university. So comma, write out YCC or WCC. Don't just say WCC, actually write out what it stands for. Comma, your dates, whatever, just so that they all look the same. The sections within your resume should be, again, in order of relevance, importance, both to you and also to the potential employer, but they should be within reverse chronological order within each section. Finally, I think it's a good question to kind of go back to that very preparation slide that I talked about at the beginning. You know, what is your story? What are you trying to sell? What are your strengths that make you special and unique? Sure, you're a grad student like every other grad student, but what makes you different? What do you have that stands out for you? And that's how you want to put together your resume. Again, keeping in mind your audience. So that's the basic stuff, the basic overview. Here's just some general things that my office is available to help you with. Whether you are actually working on a chemistry degree or a chemistry degree, or if you're just in one of our labs from another degree, you are more than welcome to take advantage of any of our services. Once in a while, we do run into a postdoc or a student who's in one of our labs, but isn't able to use the Handshake at Illinois system to schedule an appointment. If that happens to you, just shoot me an email and I can get the little flag added onto your account in order to allow you to do that. But for now, I'd love to entertain any questions that you all have, if there's something I can answer for you or that I did not cover. So again, feel free to either unmute yourselves or throw that into the chat, and I'm happy to answer that.
I've got a quick question about education versus research experience.
Yes.
A lot, like especially your graduate work is going to be a considerable research experience as well as your education. How would you recommend listing that in both sections? And if you do list that in both sections, how would you differentiate what you're putting in each section?
Yeah, so probably I would focus on the bulk of it being in your experience section. You can list like where it was and what your degree title was and your thesis if you want to in your education section. But as far as the nuts and bolts and what you actually accomplished, that should only go probably in your research or your experience section. Does that answer what you're asking?
Yeah, that was right on. Thanks.
Okay, great. Should you include undergrad presentations and publications as come in the chat? That's a great question. I think it really depends. So if you're applying to industry and you're already to your 2-page limit, then no. But if you're applying to academia, absolutely. Undergraduate non-related work experience, I did see that on a couple of resumes. So TAs and things like that, potentially, you know, if you're applying for an academic position and you did your whole graduate work on a fellowship and so you didn't have to TA, then yes, absolutely include your undergrad TA positions. If you are applying to, I guess it kind of, again, it depends on the employer, the type of position you're applying for. But in some cases, people I've seen have more relevant undergrad research experience, and maybe they did it for 3 or 4 years to what they're wanting to do or the industry they're wanting to go into than even what their grad work was. So in that case, I would definitely still include it. Even if it was just a summer RAU, it still might be fine. So it kind of varies from person to person and what type what your end goals are. But in general, yes, it's fine to absolutely include undergraduate work, whether it's publications or research or whatever. Another question that came in is, I'm about to graduate and I want to know how long my experience section is typically. You know, that it kind of depends on you. I mean, I don't think there's a magic number of bullets. You need to be able to fully tell your story. So I've seen some students who have almost a full page just of their graduate work because they've really invested in like 3 or 4 different projects. And in other cases, you work on the same project your whole 5 years or 4.5 or 6, whatever the case might be. And so you maybe don't have as many bullets as somebody who's really done deep dives in multiple projects. So kind of depends. I would say you're going to need probably at minimum 4 bullets to tell your story. But if you go a lot longer than that, I think it's really up to you. The biggest question is, are you thoroughly telling your story? All right, any other questions?
Got one on presentations. If you have several presentations that have a similar title or a similar topic, do you list those each individually, or do you kind of can you clump them together?
For presentations?
Yeah.
You're saying? Yeah, it's kind of up to you. I would still, if you're going to sort of truncate the list, show that you've got more. So say the total number of publication or presentations, but then you can pick and choose the highlights. So if you did a talk at, you know, an on-campus conference, and then you also talked at the SCS national conference, you might skip the one that was the local conference. You know, so it's up to you and page length. If you are doing an academic or a government CV and you've got plenty of room, throw them all on there, that's fine. But actually that made me think of one other thing that I did not mention. A lot of times you'll have publications where you've had tons of highlights. So maybe just the one publication, but the highlights. So it depends again on how it's looking. Like if it's starting to get really cluttered looking, I would suggest either leaving off the highlighted or maybe putting it into a separate category that you can kind of almost, it's not an appendix, but almost do as an appendix at the very end so that they can focus on what the actual citations were. So it kind of depends on, again, each individual, but sometimes highlights can get really overwhelming, especially if you had a really hot paper. So great question. References on a CV or a resume. So if you do include those, your magic number is between 3 and 5. So no fewer than 3, no more than 5. You want to include contact information, but again, at minimum, phone number and email. Better if you can also include mailing address. If you include those, they should not be on your CV, but like an addendum. So have the same heading that you've got on the very top of your CV, and then just references on that page. So your heading would say, so you've got your name, your address, then maybe references would be your heading, and then list out the contact name of those 3 to 5 references. So that would only be a page just by itself. So that way, if they don't want it, they can click that off, delete it, remove it from your PDF that you submit, or if they do want it, they can include it. But never, like, a lot of times people will say references upon request. That's kind of a duh thing. Like, just that's like saying this is my phone number. Obviously, we know it's your phone number, so it's not necessary to include it on there. All right. So next steps, I promised you that piece too. I know many of you have already been working on your resume. So if you haven't, then I would work on your resume, and then you can schedule a resume review, and you can do that a couple of different ways with my office. I mentioned that we use the Handshake at Illinois system. If you are a graduate student enrolled in classes, even that's just research, you have a Handshake at Illinois account. If you are a postdoc, you may or may not have a Handshake at Illinois account, but you can set one up pretty easily. So feel free to shoot me an email. My contact information is down there at the bottom, and we can tell you how to set that account up. And then you would use that account to schedule an appointment with my office. The other option, because I know many of you are super busy with your research, if you would rather just have an electronic review, we can do that too. So you would send it to that email address at the bottom of the screen and just let us know, hey, could you look this over? And then either Jennifer, who works in my office, or I would review your resume, put critique stuff right on that document, and then email it back to you. If you are doing that for like a fellowship and there's a deadline date coming up, be sure to give us at least 2 business days to review your documents before you need to submit it. Just because sometimes we do get a pretty high number of those. So, but feel free to also connect with us either through LinkedIn or any number of social media areas, and we would be happy to answer questions that you might have via email or give our office a call at any time. All right, any last questions for anybody today? Okay, well, seeing none, thank you for joining us today. And like I said, feel free to schedule an appointment to have your resume reviewed or shoot it to us via email. And we are more than happy to help you, whether you are a first-year student or a third-year postdoc ready to go out into the big bad world, or anywhere in between. We're here to help. So just let us know how we can do that. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.